Hey you, yes you, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get into tonight's true crime case. So don't forget subscribe this channel and turn on notification. Story 1. Queensland's coastal winds carried a strange kind of silence that winter. I had arrived in the small town of Maryborough not in search of serenity, but for something far more elusive, answers. Phoebe Bishop had vanished 6 months earlier without a single trace, and I had taken it upon myself to understand what had happened. The case had grown cold in the eyes of the local authorities, yet for some reason, it had begun to burn in me. I had never met Phoebe personally, but I had seen her photos and read enough about her to feel I knew the contours of her life. A 28-year-old wildlife researcher, Phoebe had recently returned to Australia after a year of conservation work in Borneo. According to her friends and colleagues, she was fiercely independent and passionate about environmental science. She had no known enemies and no history of mental illness or instability. One day she was hiking along the Burrum Coast National Park, and the next she was gone. I arrived at her last known residence, a modest single-story cottage hidden beneath a dense canopy of eucalyptus trees. The property was still technically hers, although her family had stopped visiting weeks ago. With their permission and support, I stayed in the house to conduct my research. The place had a certain stillness to it, as though waiting for her to return. Her hiking boots were still near the back door. A field journal lay open on the kitchen table, with notes about shorebird migration patterns and coastal erosion. The first few days were spent familiarizing myself with her routines. She had often walked the trails of the Burrum Coast during early mornings. I retraced her steps, studying the overgrown paths and broken branches, seeking anything the initial search might have missed. Local wildlife rangers recalled her asking detailed questions about a remote part of the forest rarely accessed by tourists. It was marked on no public maps, but an old conservation survey revealed a small area called Crooked Hollow, a place once used for ecological studies in the 80s but long since abandoned. On the 5th day of my investigation, I ventured toward Crooked Hollow. The forest grew denser, quieter, branches intertwined like old secrets, and underfoot, the ground was damp from an earlier rain. There was no official trail, only faint markings on the trees and the remnants of wooden posts left by past researchers. I found the skeletal remains of what might have been a station or shed, but there was nothing definitive, only rust and ruin. Still, something about the place lingered in my thoughts, as if it held part of the story. Back in the cottage, I pored over Phoebe's journals. She had taken detailed notes about her findings and thoughts, often sketching bird nests, tides, and rock formations. But then 2 entries caught my eye. One referenced a series of strange, shallow holes near Crooked Hollow, almost like they had been dug and filled again. The second was a cryptic mention of hearing a metallic clinking sound on multiple nights, which she attributed to equipment left behind. Her writing grew less confident in those final pages, as if she was aware something wasn't right but unsure of what it was. Determined to learn more, I visited the local archives in town. Among the dusty filing cabinets and brittle pages, I uncovered an environmental impact report from 1987. It detailed a quiet dispute between the government and a private research group that had once operated in Crooked Hollow. The project was abruptly halted after allegations of data manipulation and environmental violations. There was no mention of any wrongdoing beyond scientific misconduct, but the records were vague and redacted in places. Something had clearly been covered up. I reached out to one of the researchers listed in the report, a now-retired biologist living 2 towns over. When I visited him, he was reluctant to speak. Still, through veiled comments, I learned that Crooked Hollow was once considered a blind spot in regulatory oversight, a place where research could be conducted without much scrutiny. When pressed about the purpose of the project, he became evasive and simply said that it was a different time. As I walked away from his house, I felt the pieces beginning to form a shape. Phoebe may have uncovered something old, buried, forgotten. Whether it was environmental or human in nature, I didn't yet know. But I believed she had found traces of that secret and perhaps come too close. The next phase of my search focused on a set of coordinates scribbled in the back of her journal. They led me deeper into the woods, beyond Crooked Hollow, to a flat clearing that had no signs of life except for an unnatural ring of stones in the center. I found remnants of broken glass, corroded metal, and what looked like pieces of field equipment, though it was too far gone to identify. There were no signs of struggle, no clothing, no personal items, just absence. Weeks passed. My days were spent combing through land records, talking to locals, and wandering the forest trails. I encountered roadblocks in the form of missing documents, forgotten names, and officials who no longer worked in the area. It was as if the further I delved, the more the past resisted me. Then, a minor breakthrough came in the form of a trail camera log from the local ranger station. A motion-activated device, long since inactive, had captured a figure resembling Phoebe 2 days before her disappearance. She was alone, walking along a narrow ridge leading to Crooked Hollow, her backpack heavier than usual. The timestamp confirmed it was late afternoon, and the direction suggested she was headed toward the old site with intent, not aimlessness. I spent the following days combing the area with a metal detector and a borrowed soil sampler. I unearthed more fragments, bits of paper, scorched wires, and soil with chemical traces far outside the natural baseline. When I sent a sample to a friend at a university lab, the results showed traces of substances once used in experimental soil treatments, some of which had been banned decades ago. That information reopened the case. Authorities couldn't ignore environmental contamination, and an official investigation was launched, although quietly. A full-scale dig commenced in the forest under the guise of land restoration. While no body was ever found, a cache of illegally buried research equipment was uncovered, along with heavily decayed documents protected by weatherproof tubes. Some bore the same private insignia seen in the 1987 report. The inquiry eventually linked the buried materials to the same research group from decades past. Phoebe, it was concluded, had likely discovered the site and, through her research, brought light to something meant to stay hidden. Whether she vanished due to an accident, disorientation, or other unknown forces remains unsolved. Today, a plaque stands at the edge of the Burham Coast Trail, dedicated to Phoebe Bishop, wildlife advocate and seeker of truth. Her case is still technically open, but it's no longer discussed in town. Locals nod politely when her name is mentioned but rarely engage further. There's a silence in that forest that still feels watchful. As for me, I left Queensland changed. I had not found all the answers, but I had walked the path she walked, traced her thoughts, and shared in her final mystery. Some stories do not end with resolutions, only ripples. And Phoebe's ripple continues to reach me, even now, long after the winds of Maryborough have grown still again. Story 2. Some stories stay with you, not because of their horror, but because of their quiet, unanswered ache. I first came across the name Alyssa Rose Wiest while compiling a report on unsolved homicides in rural areas of the northeastern United States. Her case was barely mentioned in news archives, tucked into the corners of local papers, mentioned briefly and then forgotten by most. But something about it refused to let go of me. Alyssa was 24 when she died in the fall of 2013. A recent graduate of a small liberal arts college in Pennsylvania, she had returned to her hometown of Juniata County, a region marked by vast woodlands, narrow country roads, and tight-knit communities. She had taken a job at a veterinary clinic and was living alone in a small rental house on the outskirts of Mifflin Town, surrounded by quiet neighbors and wide fields. Her life, by all accounts, was ordinary in the best of ways, marked by routine, steady employment, and the occasional weekend visit to her parents. She kept a garden in the back, volunteered at an animal shelter on Sundays, and jogged the same trail along the Juniata River every morning. There were no police reports, no stalkers, no domestic incidents. And yet, on the evening of October 12th, she was found dead inside her home under circumstances that were never fully explained. I arrived in Mifflintown 10 years later with a notebook, a digital recorder, and a determination to understand what had gone so wrong for someone who had done so little to invite harm. Her murder remained officially unsolved, though there were vague references to persons of interest in the initial reports. The local sheriff's department had conducted interviews, searched the premises, and sent forensic materials to the state crime lab. Nothing ever came of it. The house where Alyssa had lived still stood. It was now occupied by a young couple who had moved in only 2 years prior. They allowed me to walk around the property briefly, out of respect, they said, and with no desire to revisit the past. I noticed the structure had aged. The paint was peeling slightly along the windows, and the backyard garden had gone to seed. A wind chime hung near the porch, barely moving in the autumn air. My investigation began at the county library, where I requested access to archived newspapers and court records. The articles were sparse, though I managed to piece together the original timeline. Alyssa's co-workers had reported her missing after she failed to show up for work 2 days in a row. Police conducted a welfare check and found her inside, deceased. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. Her car was still parked outside. Toxicology showed no drugs or alcohol in her system. The cause of death was listed vaguely as trauma, but the reports didn't specify more. To this day, the final medical examiner's conclusion remains sealed from public access. I next visited the veterinary clinic where Alyssa had worked. The business had changed owners, but one receptionist still remembered her. A quiet, polite young woman who kept to herself and was never known to cause any trouble. I asked about her relationships, any signs of stress or conflict in the days before her death, but the response was always the same. Alyssa had lived a life of calm predictability. No enemies, no scandals, nothing that would raise concern. At the sheriff's office, I submitted a public records request for the original case file. While much of the detailed forensic information was redacted or unavailable, I did receive access to a few interview summaries. One neighbor had mentioned hearing a loud noise, described as a heavy thud, on the night of her death, but had assumed it was something minor. Another resident noted that a white pickup truck had been parked near Alyssa's house earlier that day, though they couldn't recall if it was familiar to the neighborhood. I took that detail and began scanning DMV records and traffic camera logs, most of which had long since been purged. Yet, by cross-referencing local employment databases and public social media accounts from that time, I was able to identify several individuals in the area who drove similar vehicles. One stood out, a maintenance worker who had been employed by the rental property company that managed Alyssa's home. He had done routine repairs there just weeks before her death. His name was buried in the case summary, though never formally listed as a suspect. He had a record, minor theft, a few public disturbance citations, nothing violent. I found his last known address in a nearby town and drove out to see if he still lived there. The house was dark and unkempt, and a neighbor confirmed he had moved years ago. No forwarding address. Just gone. I filed a follow-up with the Pennsylvania State Police, requesting an update on the investigation. The reply came 2 weeks later, polite but generic. The case remained open and active. No further comment. It was clear that, for all intents and purposes, it had long been shelved. Back in Mifflin Town, I spent more time speaking to Alyssa's former classmates, teachers, and acquaintances. One theme repeated. She was a reserved, intelligent woman with a deep sense of empathy. She preferred quiet settings, read often, and rarely went out at night. She had few close friends, but no known disputes. She had recently adopted a stray cat. She had plans to return to graduate school the following year. And then one night, she simply ceased to exist in the world. I stood at the trail where she used to jog, now partially overgrown. Its wooden signage faded. The river beside it flowed slowly, unconcerned with human tragedies. I tried to imagine her running along the path, headphones in, unaware that her story would be cut short by someone who would never be held accountable. What continued to haunt me wasn't just the lack of justice, but the sheer vacuum of reason. In most cases, there's a motive, passion, revenge, jealousy. But Alyssa's life offered no obvious target. The very randomness of it all made it harder to accept. Before leaving town, I visited her grave. It sat near the edge of the cemetery, beneath a maple tree, the headstone small and simple. I placed a single stone atop the marker, a silent tradition I'd adopted in honor of the lives I researched. As I stood there, the wind picked up slightly, rustling the dry leaves. It felt like a whisper, not of fear, but of memory. In the end, I returned home without solving the case, but with a renewed understanding of how fragile justice can be and how easily a name can slip from public view. Alyssa Rose Wiest deserved more, not only in life, but in remembrance. So I wrote this story, not to reopen wounds or chase ghosts, but to ensure that her name does not fade entirely into silence. Some cases grow cold in filing cabinets, but they remain warm in the hearts of those who choose to remember. And remembering, I believe, is the first form of justice we can offer. Story 3. Bielefeld is a city many people in Germany joke doesn't exist. It's a local legend of sorts, fueled by the idea that nothing of note ever happens there. But for me, it became the site of something very real, an event that changed the lives of many and left unanswered questions in its wake. I was there not as a journalist or investigator, but simply as a visiting researcher staying on a fellowship at the university. When the attack occurred, I found myself drawn into a world of quiet confusion and resilience. I had arrived in Bielefeld in late autumn, the kind of season when the air becomes crisp and the leaves blanket the old stone streets. My schedule was filled with lectures, long hours at the library, and casual afternoons wandering through the central district. I had been drawn to the city by its understated charm and the quiet efficiency of its rhythm. On the afternoon of November 17th, everything changed. A stabbing attack occurred in the heart of the city, just meters from the Altstadt station. The details emerged slowly, and at first they were vague. A lone individual had suddenly turned violent, injuring several people before being apprehended. The motives were unclear, and so too was the identity of the attacker. Bielefeld, a city known for its calm, was now the center of a frightening disruption. I hadn't witnessed the event firsthand, but I had walked through the same area just minutes before. News of the attack reached me while I was at a cafe, and the reaction of the people around me was immediate, a kind of collective shock rippling through quiet phones and furrowed brows. The sirens soon followed, echoing through the narrow streets, followed by the arrival of police vehicles and emergency responders. In the days that followed, the incident dominated local news. The victims, 5 in total, were recovering in hospital. None had suffered fatal injuries, a fact that felt like a small mercy in the wake of the violence. The attacker, a man in his 30s, had no prior record. He was known to authorities only for minor infractions and had been living in a nearby housing complex. Investigators released minimal details, citing mental health evaluations and an ongoing investigation. The lack of transparency bred unease. I felt compelled to understand more, not out of morbid curiosity, but because I had grown to care for the city that had quietly adopted me. I began to compile my own notes, the layout of the area, statements made by local witnesses, and archived articles about other public disturbances in the region. I traced the movements of the day, matching timelines with CCTV coverage published in official briefings. I walked the route the attacker had taken and visited the intersection where the first victim was found. What stood out to me wasn't the act itself, but the atmosphere that lingered afterward. The people of Bielefeld were shaken, but not panicked. There were no angry protests or campaigns of blame. The attack was viewed not just as a crime, but as a rupture in the social fabric, a moment of sudden fear in a place unused to violence. In conversations with residents, I heard stories of kindness and solidarity. A shop owner had locked strangers inside for safety. A bystander had used his coat to stop someone's bleeding. Another had guided children away from the scene without hesitation. These small acts reminded me that in the darkest moments, humanity still speaks. I visited the local police station to request access to any public records related to the attack. While much of the case file remained sealed, a brief summary was released by authorities a week later. It confirmed that the attack was not linked to any organized movement, ideology, or group. The perpetrator had acted alone, in what appeared to be a mental health crisis. He was undergoing psychiatric evaluation and would not be released until deemed safe. No charges had yet been formally pressed pending his medical assessment. This brought a strange sort of closure, but not the kind anyone had hoped for. The city knew who had done it, but not why. Motive is often the heart of justice, the thing that gives reason to senselessness. But in this case, the absence of motive was what lingered most. I attended a community memorial service held in a nearby church. There were candles, readings, and music, not in mourning of lives lost, but in recognition of lives disrupted. Several victims were present, seated quietly near the front, their injuries bandaged, their eyes distant. It was a somber gathering, not one of fear, but of resolve. The people of Bielefeld weren't seeking vengeance. They were seeking healing. As the weeks passed, the city returned to its steady rhythm. The street where the attack took place was cleaned, the police presence faded, and the conversations in cafes returned to the mundane. Yet something had changed. I noticed more community events focused on mental health awareness. Posters offering support lines appeared in university corridors and public buildings. A subtle shift had occurred, not driven by fear, but by care. I stayed in Bielefeld for another 2 months, watching as the city quietly recovered. My research continued, though I often found my thoughts drifting back to that day in November. Not just to the act, but to the silence that followed, the slow, unspoken resilience of a city rarely mentioned in headlines. Eventually, I returned home, but I carried Bielefeld with me, not as a city marked by violence, but as a place that had refused to let fear define it. The incident had shaken its foundation, yes, but it had also revealed a depth of strength that often lies hidden beneath the surface of peaceful towns. I never learned the full story behind the attacker's life or what led to his actions that day, but I did learn about the people who responded, not with hate, but with calm, compassion, and quiet courage. In the end, I wrote this story not to sensationalize, but to remember, not to focus on the act of harm, but on the acts of humanity that followed. Because sometimes, even in the midst of tragedy, the most important truths are found not in what is broken, but in what endures. Story 4. My work often took me to quiet corners of America, the kind of places where people assumed life moved slowly and crime passed them by. It was in one of those places, a rural stretch just outside Savannah, Georgia, where I encountered the story of Bella Cully. What I thought would be a routine report on a minor drug-related arrest quickly unfolded into a complicated, deeply human case of misjudgment, desperation, and the dark mechanics of exploitation. The arrest itself had been uneventful. A 22-year-old woman detained at the Savannah/Hilton Head International Airport with several packages of controlled substances concealed in her luggage. The customs officers had flagged her for a secondary search due to inconsistencies in her travel records. She was traveling alone, returning from a brief trip to the Caribbean, and had only a backpack and a small suitcase. What they found inside was enough to trigger federal charges. When I first read the report, I assumed this was another instance of organized drug trafficking using young couriers. These cases were unfortunately common and usually led to stiff penalties and lengthy sentences. But what stood out about Bella was how little she resembled the stereotypical profile. She had no criminal history, no gang affiliations, no significant income or overseas connections. She had grown up in Macon, Georgia, and had been working 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. I decided to learn more, not just about the arrest, but about the life that led to it. I began by reaching out to the county courthouse for public records. Bella had been arraigned quickly after her arrest, and while much of the evidence remained sealed due to ongoing proceedings, I was able to review transcripts from her bond hearing. Her court-appointed attorney argued that she had been manipulated by someone she trusted, coerced into transporting packages she did not fully understand. The prosecution painted a different picture, one of willful participation in a broader trafficking network. To gain context, I traveled to Macon and visited the neighborhood where Bella had grown up. It was a modest area, single-story homes, quiet streets, and families that had lived there for decades. Her former neighbors described her as a quiet, smart, and determined young woman who had helped care for her siblings after her father's sudden death. Her mother had struggled with health issues, and Bella had taken on much of the household responsibility during her teenage years. It was in that context I later learned that she had fallen into contact with an older man who had presented himself as a friend, then a benefactor, and finally a guide to easy money. He had offered her help with rent and groceries, then suggested she accompany him on a trip as a favor. The details became murkier from there. Some believed she knew what she was carrying. Others insisted she had been misled entirely. I tried to verify these claims by tracking down the man in question, whose name appeared in the arrest affidavit. He had a record spanning 3 states, mostly involving fraud and distribution charges. He had not been arrested alongside Bella. In fact, by the time the authorities searched for him, he had vanished, likely tipped off or already in transit. His social media accounts were wiped, and his last known address was vacant. Bella, it seemed, had been left behind to absorb the full weight of the law. At the Federal Detention Center in Georgia, I met with a contact from the public defender's office who had worked on Bella's case. Though bound by confidentiality, they shared broad insights into how vulnerable individuals are often used as disposable intermediaries in drug trafficking. The courier, often unaware or only partially informed, is easy to replace. Their capture means little to the higher rungs of the operation. In many cases, these young carriers serve time for crimes engineered by someone else's hands. Bella's case was heading toward a plea deal. The prosecution had agreed to reduce the charges in exchange for cooperation, though there was little Bella could offer in return. With the suspected ringleader gone and no access to phone records linking her to larger players, her only leverage was her testimony, and even that was limited. Her sentence, I learned, would likely be several years in federal prison, with eligibility for early release based on behavior and participation in rehabilitation programs. I reflected often on the larger implications. Bella's story was not one of hardened criminality, but of systemic failure, economic hardship, limited oversight, and the predatory tactics of experienced traffickers. Her arrest had made a brief headline in regional news, then disappeared beneath stories with more sensational weight. But for her, it marked the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Before leaving Georgia, I returned to the airport terminal where she had been detained. It was an ordinary place, filled with business travelers, tourists, and families with small children. The contrast was jarring. Somewhere among the crowds, Bella had stood with her luggage, perhaps unsure, perhaps terrified, hoping to board a flight and return home with a promise fulfilled, only to be stopped by agents whose training had taught them where to look. Her story haunted me not because it was rare, but because it was common. Thousands of people, especially young women, are drawn into trafficking under the guise of opportunity or trust. Some know, many do not, but when the law arrives, it draws few distinctions. I continued to follow Bella's case even after returning home. Several months later, I learned that she had been sentenced to 6 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 4. Her family had issued a brief statement thanking the court for its fairness and vowing to support her through her incarceration. Her attorney filed motions for sentence reduction tied to new evidence, but there was little hope of reversal. In the final analysis, Bella Cully became a statistic in a system built to process, not understand. But behind that statistic was a young woman whose story reflected the complexity of crime and consequence. A cautionary tale not of evil, but of vulnerability. And while the system rendered its judgment, it was the silence afterward that lingered, the absence of the voices who had used her and vanished. I wrote this not to excuse, but to remember, because in a world where names disappear behind case numbers, it is easy to forget that every arrest is a life paused. Every sentence is a story interrupted, and every young person who falls through the cracks leaves behind a trail we should all be willing to trace. Story 5. In the vibrant city of Zapopan, Jalisco, where the rhythms of daily life intertwine with the digital pulse of social media, I found myself immersed in a community that thrived on creativity and connection. As a journalist with a keen interest in the intersection of technology and society, I was drawn to the stories that unfolded in this dynamic environment. Among the many voices that resonated through the digital landscape, one stood out: Valeria Marquez. Valeria was a 23-year-old beauty influencer whose presence on platforms like TikTok and Instagram captivated thousands. Her content, a blend of makeup tutorials, lifestyle snippets, and glimpses into her entrepreneurial journey, painted a picture of ambition and authenticity. She was not just a content creator. She was a symbol of empowerment for many young women navigating the complexities of modern life. Her salon, Blossom, the beauty lounge, nestled in a bustling commercial area, became a hub for creativity and community. It was more than a place for beauty treatments. It was a space where stories were shared and dreams were nurtured. Valeria's charisma and dedication transformed her salon into a beacon for those seeking inspiration and transformation. On May 13, 2025, the tranquility of this vibrant community was shattered. Valeria was conducting a live stream from her salon, engaging with her audience in her usual warm and enthusiastic manner. The atmosphere was lighthearted, filled with laughter and the familiar hum of daily activities. Suddenly, the unexpected occurred. A man entered the salon, posing as a delivery person bearing a gift. He handed Valeria a plush toy and a beverage, items that seemed innocuous but carried a sinister undertone. Moments later, the man revealed his true intentions, committing an act of violence that ended Valeria's life. The incident unfolded in real time, witnessed by her online followers who were left in shock and disbelief. The news of Valeria's tragic death spread rapidly, igniting a wave of mourning and outrage across social media platforms. The community that once celebrated her achievements now grappled with the loss of a beloved figure. Vigils were held, tributes poured in, and conversations about safety and the vulnerabilities of public figures intensified. Authorities launched an investigation, treating the case as a potential femicide, a term used in Mexico to describe gender-based killings of women. The suspect, who fled the scene on a motorcycle, left behind a trail of questions and a community yearning for justice. Speculations arose about possible motives, including connections to organized crime, but official statements remained cautious, emphasizing the ongoing nature of the investigation. As I delved deeper into Valeria's story, I encountered a tapestry of narratives that highlighted the complexities of her life and the broader societal issues at play. Interviews with friends and colleagues painted a portrait of a determined young woman who navigated the challenges of entrepreneurship and digital fame with grace and resilience. Her journey was emblematic of the aspirations and struggles faced by many in the digital age. The incident also sparked a broader discourse on the safety of influencers and the responsibilities of social media platforms in protecting their users. Discussions about the potential risks associated with public visibility and the need for systemic changes to address gender-based violence gained momentum. Valeria's story became a catalyst for conversations that extended beyond the confines of her immediate community. In the weeks that followed, the salon remained closed, a somber reminder of the vibrant life that once animated its walls. Memorials adorned the entrance, and messages of love and remembrance filled the space. The community's grief was palpable, yet amidst the sorrow, there was a collective resolve to honor Valeria's legacy by advocating for change. Reflecting on Valeria's life and the circumstances of her death, I was struck by the profound impact she had on those around her. Her ability to connect, inspire, and uplift was evident in the outpouring of support and the enduring conversations her story sparked. In documenting her journey, I was reminded of the power of storytelling to illuminate the human experience and to drive societal reflection and transformation. Valeria Marquez's life, though tragically cut short, continues to resonate. Her story serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of life, the importance of community, and the enduring quest for justice and equality. As we navigate the complexities of the digital era, her legacy challenges us to create spaces that are not only innovative and expressive, but also safe and inclusive for all. Story 6. In early spring, I arrived in Bolzano, a quiet city nestled in the Alpine region of northern Italy, drawn not by its stunning landscapes or peaceful streets, but by a growing whisper that something dark had been unfolding beneath the surface. As an independent investigative journalist focusing on extremism in Europe, I had followed a trail of information that led me directly into the heart of a case involving the Order of Nine Angles, often referred to by its initials, O9A. For years, O9A had existed on the peripheries of most people's awareness, an obscure and ideologically extreme group tied loosely to both neo-Nazi occultism and fringe extremist beliefs. Most dismissed their influence as abstract or symbolic, an unsettling curiosity at best. But in Bolzano, I discovered the group's ideology had taken root in a very real and alarming way. I was first alerted by a confidential source within the Italian Carabinieri, who suggested there had been a developing investigation into a local cell suspected of plotting acts of domestic terrorism. Though the operation had been largely conducted under the radar, it had recently culminated in a decisive action. The arrest of 3 individuals with alleged ties to O9A who were in the process of preparing a violent act designed to destabilize public institutions and provoke chaos. When I arrived, Bolzano was calm, as if untouched by the fear such a revelation might usually provoke. Locals went about their daily routines, and the city's charming blend of Italian and German cultures remained undisturbed. It was this contrast, the appearance of peace masking a hidden danger, that compelled me to dig deeper. My investigation began with public records and court documents. The suspects, all under the age of 30, had no prior convictions and came from seemingly ordinary backgrounds. A university student in philosophy, a young mechanic, and a former soldier recently discharged from service. What tied them together, I learned, was an online network where extremist beliefs were shared and reinforced under the guise of intellectual inquiry. According to the authorities, the suspects had been radicalized over several years through encrypted messaging platforms and obscure forums where O9A literature was distributed. They discussed not only philosophical concepts but operational strategies and logistics. My contact shared with me anonymized transcripts that showed discussions about disrupting local infrastructure and targeting institutions perceived as symbols of modernity and moral decay. As I traced their digital footprints, a clear pattern emerged. These individuals had fallen into a worldview that framed violence as a form of ascension, borrowed from O9A's esoteric belief that chaos and destruction were tools for spiritual growth. Although the ideology was convoluted, the consequences were chillingly concrete. The plot itself was still classified in parts, but I was able to confirm from legal documents and investigative sources that the group had been surveilling several targets in Bolzano and nearby regions. Their goal was not mass harm but symbolic impact. Attacks that would generate fear, media attention, and what they referred to as cosmic disturbance. They believed such acts would elevate their standing in what they perceived as a metaphysical war between light and darkness. Authorities acted just in time. Through coordinated surveillance and digital monitoring, they intercepted communications that indicated an attack was imminent. In early March, just days before the planned execution, police raided 3 separate residences, uncovering not only ideological materials but also detailed plans, maps, and improvised components that could have been used to cause significant disruption. The arrests were swift and without resistance. In court, the suspects appeared expressionless, and their defense teams emphasized their clients' youth and disconnection from real-world consequences. But investigators were not convinced this was mere play acting. The thoroughness of the plans, the level of secrecy, and the intensity of their ideological commitment pointed to genuine intent. The case sent ripples through national and international intelligence circles. While O9A had previously been considered a marginal threat, Bolzano served as a wake-up call. The combination of online radicalization, esoteric ideology, and youthful disillusionment was proving volatile. I attended one of the early pretrial hearings, sitting quietly among a handful of journalists and legal observers. The judge summarized the threat with a quiet firmness that resonated deeply. This was not just a matter of public safety but of ideological manipulation, of young lives redirected toward darkness under the illusion of enlightenment. In the aftermath of the arrests, Bolzano responded not with panic but with reflection. Local officials launched workshops on digital literacy and radicalization prevention. Schools hosted forums on resilience, and community leaders emphasized the importance of open dialogue and vigilance. There was a collective effort to understand what had happened and ensure it would not happen again. For me, covering the story was a reminder of how extremism can take root in unlikely places, and how ideology, especially when wrapped in the aesthetics of rebellion or secrecy, can lure the unguarded mind. The O9 terror plot was foiled, but its shadow lingered. A challenge to remain aware, to ask difficult questions, and to defend the quiet peace of places like Bolzano. I left the city weeks later with my notes, recordings, and observations forming the foundation of a broader report I would publish later that month. The experience changed how I viewed the evolving landscape of extremist threats in Europe. Bolzano taught me that the real battleground is not only physical but philosophical, waged in minds, online forums, and the ideological fringes of youth discontent. Though the plot had been stopped, the story was not over. The trials would continue, and perhaps with time we might learn more about what drew these young people down such a path. My work, as always, was not to speculate, but to bear witness, to document, understand, and ensure that the truth, once uncovered, would never be buried again. Story 7. My journey to Lucknow began with the intention of understanding one of the most delicate and complex subjects embedded in social structures across the world: honor-based violence. As a journalist working on human rights and social justice issues, I had covered various forms of violence masked by tradition, but this case struck a chord deeper than most. In the summer of 2024, news quietly surfaced from a suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Lucknow, the capital of Uttar Pradesh, that a young woman had gone missing under circumstances that raised more questions than answers. Her name was Aisha Khan, a 22-year-old university student studying sociology. Her aspirations, as I later learned, leaned towards social reform and education for girls in rural India, an ambition that had once made her family proud. Her sudden disappearance didn't initially draw much attention. The police registered a missing persons report, but there was little urgency in the early days. Aisha's family insisted she had traveled to visit relatives in another city, but inconsistencies soon emerged. Relatives claimed no such visit had been planned. Friends revealed that Aisha had been withdrawn in the weeks before she vanished. Professors recalled her passionate commitment to women's rights, a passion that perhaps had grown uncomfortable within her own home. I arrived in Lucknow shortly after a small activist group called Dastak flagged her case in a local newspaper. I made contact with the group, and through their assistance, I was able to begin piecing together Aisha's story. What unfolded was a deeply troubling narrative of generational conflict, gender expectations, and a family's descent into an act they would come to justify under the veil of so-called honor. Aisha had been in a relationship with a classmate, a young man from a different religious background. While the relationship was not public, it was not entirely hidden either. In a conservative neighborhood where social reputation often outweighs individual happiness, this relationship, if exposed, had the potential to become a point of tension. Through interviews with Aisha's friends and a handful of university contacts, I discovered she had considered eloping. She feared her family would never approve. It was this fear, I believe, that made her vulnerable. She confided in one person too many, and word eventually reached her older brother. From that moment, the trajectory of her life began to curve toward tragedy. The family, once proud of Aisha's achievements, saw her actions not as expressions of independence, but as threats to their status. What unfolded next was revealed only through careful, patient investigation. Documents, witness testimonies, and later, a confession. Aisha had been lured back home on the pretense of a family discussion. She never returned to campus. It took authorities several weeks, under public pressure, to reclassify the case from a missing person report to a potential homicide investigation. Anonymous tips had begun to surface. Neighbors overheard arguments, a gardener noticed a section of land newly disturbed, and a former domestic worker reported seeing the family unusually tense. The police eventually uncovered enough evidence to act. After a search of the family property, forensic experts identified irregularities that prompted deeper excavation. What they found was heartbreaking but inevitable. Aisha's body was recovered in the backyard, and though the exact cause of death remained classified, it was clear that her passing had not been natural. Her parents and two brothers were arrested shortly after. The family's statements were restrained, marked by sorrow and what appeared to be a conviction that they had done what was necessary. In custody, one of the brothers reportedly spoke of honor, dignity, and the need to protect the family's reputation. It was difficult to listen to. They mourned not her death, but the shame they believed her life choices would have brought. What struck me most in covering this case was how normalized such actions could be within certain closed circles. Honor, a concept meant to signify integrity, was twisted into justification for silence and violence. Aisha was silenced for choosing to live on her terms. In the aftermath, activists and educators in Lucknow rallied for justice. The case sparked renewed calls for reform in how honor-based crimes are investigated and prosecuted in India. Awareness campaigns were launched in schools and universities. Survivors of similar abuse began to come forward, emboldened by the growing support network forming around Aisha's memory. I visited her university before leaving the city. Her name was scribbled in a corner of a classroom blackboard by a classmate who simply wrote, "For Aisha, who taught us to question." I stood in silence for a long time, reflecting on the quiet, determined courage it must have taken her to live authentically in the face of such resistance. This case, while devastating, is not unique, but it must be told not to sensationalize, but to illuminate the hidden currents of control and expectation that still shape the lives of many. Aisha was not merely a victim. She was a symbol of a young generation striving for autonomy, equality, and self-expression. Her legacy lives on through community action, policy discussions, and the hearts of those she touched. And for me, as someone who bore witness to the traces of her story, it reaffirmed the importance of listening, to whispers, to silences, to truths that struggle to rise beneath layers of tradition and fear. As I filed my final report and prepared to leave Lucknow, I knew the work was far from over. Stories like Aisha's needed to be told again and again, not for the sake of tragedy, but to reshape the very meaning of honor into something that affirms life rather than extinguishing it. Story 8. My work as an investigative journalist has taken me to many corners of the world, but the story I uncovered in Puente Alto, a bustling commune on the outskirts of Santiago, Chile, remains one of the most haunting and profound I have ever encountered. It was a story that unfolded quietly at first, yet its ripple effects touched not only a single family but an entire community. The news first reached me through a colleague in Santiago who mentioned an unusually grim case that had captured public attention. A family of 6 had perished under tragic and mysterious circumstances in their home. The official reports called it a family massacre, a phrase heavy with implications and sorrow. Intrigued and disturbed, I knew this was a story that demanded a careful, empathetic investigation. I traveled to Puente Alto shortly after the initial police investigation had concluded its on-site work. The neighborhood where the family lived was a modest, working-class area, lined with narrow streets and closely packed houses. Despite the tragedy, daily life continued. Children played, vendors sold fruits, and neighbors exchanged greetings. Yet beneath the everyday normalcy, I sensed an unspoken heaviness. The family at the center of this tragedy was the Villanueva household. Patriarch Eduardo Villanueva was a man known in the neighborhood as hardworking and reserved. His wife, Marcela, was quiet but kind, involved in local church activities and community gatherings. Their 4 children ranged from teenagers to a young child. By all external accounts, they appeared to be a typical, if modest, Chilean family. What I soon discovered, however, was that appearances can be deceiving. My conversations with neighbors painted a picture of increasing tension within the household, though no one could quite pinpoint why. There were whispered stories about Eduardo's struggles with unemployment and bouts of depression, and Marcela's efforts to keep the family together under mounting stress. Some neighbors noted a growing silence from the children, a withdrawal that unsettled those who cared to notice. The turning point in the investigation came when the police revealed that the event was not a simple accident or external attack, but something far more tragic and complex. The family had all died within their home in a span of hours, under circumstances pointing toward a murder-suicide scenario. Official reports remained circumspect about the details, but from what I could gather through public records, interviews with local authorities, and analysis of the court proceedings, the tragedy was linked to severe mental health challenges and a cascade of unresolved personal crises. Eduardo Villanueva, overwhelmed by despair and feeling unable to provide for his family, reportedly made a devastating decision. The investigation suggested that he took the lives of his wife and children before turning the weapon on himself. Though heartbreaking, the authorities emphasized that the act was not born from malice but from a profound psychological breakdown. Throughout my research, I grappled with the complexity of mental health stigma in Chilean society, especially in working-class communities where resources and understanding are often limited. Eduardo's story, while uniquely tragic, echoed a much larger issue: how economic hardship, emotional isolation, and untreated mental illness can intersect with catastrophic consequences. In conversations with social workers and mental health professionals in Puente Alto, I learned that many families silently suffer under pressures exacerbated by unemployment, poverty, and lack of support. Eduardo's family, it seemed, was emblematic of these silent struggles. I visited the local community center where Marcela had volunteered, speaking with women who remembered her as a warm presence striving to keep her family afloat. Their sorrow was palpable but mixed with frustration at how little help the family had received before the tragedy. The legal process that followed was swift but weighed with complexity. Eduardo's actions were condemned by the courts, but there was also recognition of his deteriorating mental state. His case sparked debates in Chile about expanding mental health services and providing support to families in crisis. In the months after the incident, Puente Alto experienced a wave of community mobilization. Neighbors organized outreach programs, local officials increased funding for counseling and support groups, and schools implemented mental health education initiatives. A small memorial was erected near the site of the Villanueva home, a somber reminder of a family lost but not forgotten. For me, documenting the story was both a professional responsibility and a personal challenge. I had to navigate the fine line between reporting facts and honoring the memory of people who had suffered profoundly. The story was not about sensationalism, but about shining a light on the human fragility behind headlines. As I prepared my final report, I reflected on how stories like the Villanueva families reveal the urgent need for compassion, awareness, and systemic change. The tragedy in Puente Alto was not an isolated incident, but a call to action, to address the silent suffering that too often goes unnoticed until it reaches a breaking point. Leaving Puente Alto, I carried with me a renewed sense of purpose. The story of the Villanueva family was one I wished could serve as a catalyst for greater understanding and improved care for those silently struggling. Through careful storytelling, I hope to contribute not only to remembering a family taken too soon, but also to fostering a community, and perhaps a society, that listens, supports, and intervenes before despair turns to tragedy. Story 9. My work often brings me face to face with the shadows that lurk beneath the surface of seemingly peaceful cities. Denver, Colorado, known for its vibrant neighborhoods and scenic mountain views, was no exception. Yet, between late 2023 and early 2024, the city became the backdrop for a series of unsettling events that left the community shaken and law enforcement racing against time. It began subtly, with isolated incidents reported late at night in some of Denver's quieter districts. People described attacks involving knives, but at first, the incidents seemed random and unconnected. Single victims, brief police statements, no clear suspect. I was following these reports from afar, intrigued but cautious. However, as the number of victims grew, a pattern emerged, and the term serial stabbings began to appear in headlines. I decided to come to Denver to better understand the unfolding crisis. Upon arrival, I quickly realized the fear gripping the city was palpable. Residents spoke of changing their routines, avoiding certain streets, and looking over their shoulders even in broad daylight. The attacks were happening mostly in residential areas, places where people should have felt safest. My investigation led me to the Denver Police Department, where the task force assigned to the case was working around the clock. Through careful interviews and background research, I pieced together the sequence of events. Over the course of several months, multiple individuals had been targeted, all attacked with knives but miraculously surviving in most cases. The victims ranged in age, gender, and background, which complicated the profiling process. One thing the police and community noticed was the choice of timing and location. Attacks were often occurring late at night or early morning, near parks, alleyways, or poorly lit streets. This suggested the perpetrator was familiar with these neighborhoods and possibly knew the victims or had an intimate understanding of their habits. The task force deployed new surveillance measures and encouraged residents to remain vigilant. Community meetings were held, with officers speaking openly about the ongoing investigation and safety tips. The atmosphere was tense but also marked by a strong sense of solidarity. I spent time walking these neighborhoods, speaking discreetly with local shop owners, community leaders, and residents, Many shared stories of resilience, expressing frustration but also hope. They described neighborhood watch programs and the ways people were coming together to reclaim their streets. As the investigation progressed, forensic evidence began to mount. The police identified a suspect, a man in his late 20s, with a history of minor offenses and unstable behavior. He had recently moved into one of the affected neighborhoods, raising questions about his motives and state of mind. The arrest itself was a careful operation. Law enforcement worked to ensure the safety of the community while apprehending the individual without incident. After the arrest, the suspect was held for questioning and psychiatric evaluation. Court documents later revealed that the suspect's actions were driven by complex psychological issues, including untreated mental illness. The attacks were not motivated by personal vendettas or ideological beliefs, but seemed to be manifestations of internal turmoil. This revelation shifted the community conversation. While the acts themselves were criminal and alarming, many began to discuss the broader issues of mental health care access, stigma, and support systems. Advocates emphasized the importance of early intervention and community-based resources. Denver's public health officials responded by increasing funding for mental health services and launching outreach programs aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Schools and local organizations collaborated to raise awareness and provide assistance to those in need. Throughout this process, I found myself reflecting on the delicate balance between public safety and compassionate understanding. The serial stabbings were a stark reminder that behind many violent acts, there can be unseen struggles calling out for help. In the aftermath, the victims, though deeply affected, showed remarkable strength. Support groups formed to aid their recovery, and stories of survival became sources of inspiration. Their willingness to share their experiences helped reduce stigma and encouraged others to seek help. As I prepared my report, I was struck by the resilience of Denver's community and the dedication of those working tirelessly to heal and protect. The story of the serial stabbings was not just about fear and violence, but about recovery, compassion, and hope. Leaving Denver, I carried with me the stories of many victims, law enforcement, mental health professionals, and everyday citizens united in their determination to create a safer, more understanding city. Their voices reminded me that even in the darkest times, humanity's capacity for healing and connection endures. Story 10. As a crime reporter, I have traveled to many places where stories of violence and hardship unfold. But the case in Mahayaconi, a small village in Guyana's coastal region, remains one of the most intense and complex I have ever encountered. The incident, which later became known as the meth-fueled rampage, unfolded over a single chaotic day in mid-2023, leaving a community struggling to make sense of the sudden eruption of violence. Mahayaconi is a quiet, rural village where people live close to the land, farming rice and fishing in the nearby rivers. Life there tends to follow the rhythms of nature and tradition, far from the bustling capital city of Georgetown. So when the news broke of a violent spree involving one of its residents, the shock resonated deeply across the region. My investigation began when I received reports of a man causing widespread damage and endangering lives over several hours, apparently under the influence of methamphetamine, a potent stimulant drug. The man in question, whose identity was withheld during the initial police announcements, was described as erratic and dangerous, moving swiftly through the village in a state of heightened agitation. I traveled to Mahayaconi soon after the incident, eager to understand the factors leading up to such a moment. Upon arrival, I found a community still grappling with fear and confusion. The villagers were cautious but willing to share what they knew. Many expressed sorrow not only for the events but for the man himself, who they said had once been a hardworking member of the community. Through conversations with neighbors, local officials, and health workers, I learned that the man had struggled with substance abuse for years, with methamphetamine addiction taking a toll on his mental and physical health. Despite efforts from family and community members to intervene, he had fallen deeper into addiction, which ultimately culminated in the violent episode. The rampage, as it was termed, involved the man damaging property, threatening people, and behaving unpredictably throughout the village. Although the authorities were able to intervene and prevent loss of life, the event left emotional scars and raised urgent questions about addiction, mental health, and community support systems. I delved into the background of substance abuse in rural Guyana and discovered a growing but often overlooked crisis. Methamphetamine use had been increasing in recent years, facilitated by trafficking routes and economic hardships that left many vulnerable. Health services and addiction treatment programs were limited, especially outside major urban centers. The village's isolation compounded these challenges. Many people lacked access to counseling, rehabilitation, or even basic health care. The stigma surrounding addiction further discouraged those affected from seeking help. The story of this man's descent was, tragically, not unique. Local leaders told me about their efforts to raise awareness and combat drug use, including outreach programs and educational campaigns in schools. However, they admitted that funding and resources remained inadequate to meet the growing need. The police officers involved in the response shared their perspectives with me. They described the difficult balance between protecting the community and ensuring the safety and dignity of the individual in crisis. Their swift, coordinated action prevented the situation from escalating into something far worse. After the man was detained and placed under medical supervision, he was referred to a rehabilitation program in Georgetown. His family, though shaken, remained hopeful that recovery was possible. In the months that followed, the incident in Mahakoni sparked broader conversations at regional and national levels about drug addiction, mental health, and social services. Policymakers began discussing plans to improve rural health infrastructure, expand addiction treatment options, and reduce stigma through education. My experience in Mahakoni reinforced the vital importance of viewing crime and violence through a holistic lens. Behind many incidents lies a complex web of social, economic, and health factors that require compassion and comprehensive intervention. Reporting this story demanded sensitivity and care. I aim to highlight not only the facts of the incident, but also the human struggles intertwined with it. The man's rampage was a symptom of a deeper crisis, one that communities, governments, and society as a whole must address collectively. Leaving Mahakoni, I carried with me a sense of urgency and a renewed commitment to telling stories that illuminate the hidden struggles behind headlines. The village, scarred but resilient, was a testament to the power of community and the ongoing need for support and understanding. The meth-fueled rampage was a tragedy, but it also became a catalyst for change. Through awareness, advocacy, and action, there was hope that future generations in Mahakoni and beyond could find healing and a brighter path forward. Story 11. My assignment in Cairo was supposed to be straightforward, cover the cultural richness of the city's famed museums and their role in preserving Egypt's millennia-old heritage. Yet, what began as a routine exploration quickly evolved into a complex investigation of a security breach at one of the most iconic museums in the world, the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir Square. The Egyptian Museum, home to countless artifacts from ancient times, including treasures from Tutankhamun's tomb, is not only a symbol of Egypt's glorious past, but also a beacon of national pride. The institution takes great care in safeguarding these irreplaceable relics, employing sophisticated security systems and trained personnel. So when reports surfaced that an unauthorized intrusion had occurred within the museum's walls, it sent shockwaves through the cultural and security communities. I arrived in Cairo shortly after the incident was disclosed to the public. The authorities remained tight-lipped about many details, but it was clear that the breach, though not resulting in any theft or damage to artifacts, exposed vulnerabilities in the museum's security protocols. My role was to uncover the facts while respecting the sensitivities involved. The incident happened late one night, during the museum's closed hours. Surveillance cameras caught images of an intruder entering through a rarely used service entrance. How the individual bypassed multiple layers of security baffled officials and raised questions about internal procedures and equipment reliability. My first step was to speak with security experts and museum officials who spoke of the rigorous measures usually in place. The museum's security system involved motion sensors, alarms, infrared cameras, and a team of guards stationed strategically throughout the premises. Any breach required either a sophisticated plan or an unexpected lapse. Delving deeper, I learned the intruder was a young man, unknown to the authorities, who had managed to slip past perimeter defenses and evade guards. Thankfully, no artifacts were disturbed, and the intruder was apprehended quickly by security staff before any irreversible harm could occur. What motivated the breach was initially unclear. The young man's background revealed no criminal record, but he struggled with unemployment and was reportedly seeking a way to gain attention or make a statement about his hardships. Psychological evaluations suggested his actions were impulsive rather than premeditated theft or sabotage. This revelation shifted the narrative from a high-stakes heist to a story about desperation, social pressures, and the challenges faced by many young people in Cairo today. Egypt's urban youth, especially in economically strained areas, often face limited opportunities, and the pressure to be noticed or heard can lead to dramatic acts. Throughout my investigation, I examined the broader social context. The Egyptian Museum, while a treasure trove of ancient history, is also located in a city grappling with rapid urbanization, economic shifts, and social change. The story of the security breach highlighted the intersection between heritage preservation and contemporary societal challenges. In response to the incident, the museum authorities undertook a comprehensive review of their security infrastructure. They implemented upgrades to their surveillance systems and revised protocols for staff training. Officials also launched community outreach programs, aiming to engage local youth in educational and cultural initiatives to foster a sense of belonging and purpose. Visiting the museum in the weeks following the breach, I noticed a renewed atmosphere of vigilance but also openness. The staff was committed to ensuring the safety of the collection while embracing opportunities to connect with the community. Exhibitions highlighting not only ancient history but also modern Egyptian life were being developed to bridge past and present. My reporting on the security breach aimed to balance factual accuracy with empathy. The young man's story underscored the complexity behind what might otherwise be dismissed as a simple security failure. It was a reminder that institutions like the Egyptian Museum do not exist in isolation but are part of the living fabric of the city and its people. The case also sparked discussions among security professionals worldwide about the challenges of protecting cultural heritage sites in urban environments where social issues can manifest unexpectedly. Collaborative efforts between law enforcement, cultural institutions, and community groups were seen as essential in preventing similar incidents. As my time in Cairo concluded, I reflected on how this incident, while unsettling, had brought to light important conversations about youth, security, and heritage. The young man's actions were a cry for help in a society where many struggle to find their place. The museum's response demonstrated resilience and adaptability, balancing preservation with progress. The story of the museum security breach in Cairo was not only about protecting ancient treasures, but also about understanding and addressing the human dimensions that surround such institutions. It reminded me that true security involves more than cameras and guards. It requires connection, support, and awareness of the world beyond the museum walls. Leaving Cairo, I felt a renewed appreciation for the delicate balance between history and humanity, and the ongoing efforts to safeguard both for future generations. Story 12. My journey to Istanbul was meant to be a deep dive into the city's rich cultural tapestry, where East meets West in a vibrant blend of history and modernity. However, what I encountered went far beyond the picturesque scenes and bustling bazaars. Istanbul, a gateway between continents and cultures, also harbored darker undercurrents, none more disturbing than the human trafficking network that had ensnared vulnerable individuals for years before finally being dismantled. The story began with whispers among local NGOs and international organizations about an extensive trafficking ring operating under the radar. The victims were primarily women and children from various countries, lured with promises of employment, education, or a better life. Instead, they found themselves trapped in exploitative conditions, stripped of freedom and dignity. Determined to uncover the truth, I connected with law enforcement officials, social workers, and survivors who shared pieces of the complex puzzle. The operation to dismantle this network had been long and arduous, involving months of surveillance, undercover work, and cross-border cooperation. Istanbul's sprawling neighborhoods and labyrinthine streets provided both shelter and concealment for traffickers. The ring's reach extended beyond Turkey's borders, involving networks across Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. This transnational nature complicated efforts to combat the crime, requiring coordinated international responses. The investigation revealed the traffickers' sophisticated methods. They employed forged documents, online recruitment schemes, and intimidation tactics to control their victims. Many victims had been coerced into silence through threats to their families or false promises of release. What struck me most was the resilience of the survivors. Despite the trauma they endured, many found ways to communicate their experiences and assist authorities in bringing perpetrators to justice. Their courage was the backbone of the case and a testament to human strength in the face of cruelty. The Law Enforcement Task Force, composed of local police and international agents, executed a carefully planned series of raids across Istanbul. These operations targeted safe houses, illegal businesses, and transportation hubs used by the traffickers. The coordination required precision and secrecy to ensure the safety of both the victims and officers involved. Following the arrests, a large number of victims were rescued and immediately provided with medical care, psychological support, and legal assistance. NGOs played a crucial role in facilitating their recovery and reintegration, offering shelter, education, and vocational training. The legal proceedings against the traffickers unfolded over months, revealing the hierarchy within the ring and exposing corruption that had allowed the network to operate with relative impunity for so long. The courts ultimately delivered sentences reflecting the severity of the crimes, reinforcing Turkey's commitment to combating human trafficking. Throughout this experience, I observed the challenges faced by the authorities and communities in addressing the root causes of trafficking. Poverty, lack of education, and unstable geopolitical conditions often rendered individuals vulnerable to exploitation. Addressing these factors required long-term strategies beyond law enforcement. Community outreach programs in Istanbul aimed to raise awareness and educate at-risk populations about the dangers of trafficking. Schools, religious institutions, and social organizations collaborated to provide information and support networks. My reporting sought to highlight not only the facts of the investigation but also the human stories behind the headlines. The survivors' journeys from captivity to freedom underscored the importance of compassion, comprehensive support, and societal responsibility. The dismantling of the trafficking ring was a significant victory, but the battle against human trafficking continues worldwide. Istanbul's story served as a microcosm of a global issue that demands vigilance, cooperation, and unwavering dedication. Leaving Istanbul, I carried with me a profound respect for those who fight against injustice daily. From law enforcement officers risking their lives, to social workers rebuilding shattered lives, to survivors who transform pain into hope. The city's vibrant streets, ancient monuments, and diverse cultures remained a backdrop to this ongoing struggle. Yet, within those contrasts, I witnessed a powerful narrative of resilience and the unyielding pursuit of human dignity. The story of the human trafficking ring dismantled in Istanbul is not just about crime and punishment. It is a call to action, reminding us all of our shared responsibility to protect the vulnerable and uphold the rights of every individual.